There are all sorts of trains used to get people, resources, and goods from one place to another. From the humble beginnings of steam engine locomotives to the magnetic levitation of yesterday's science fiction, trains are an integral part of many modern cities. Today on Amateur Experts, we'll be looking at the various categories of passenger rail throughout the world. First up is long-distance passenger rail. This type of service goes between different cities and regions, and is usually more than 200 miles. In the United States, Amtrak operates a considerable network of long-distance trips. These routes have relatively low ridership as compared to similar routes throughout Europe and Asia. Long-distance rail journeys generally use the same rail networks as freight trains, but in some cases, particularly with high-speed rail, these sorts of journeys are more likely to have their own dedicated rail network. In cases where these networks are shared with other types of trains, railways must operate cars to the mainline standards of the existing network. This means long-distance passenger rail must adhere to existing rail profiles and right-of-way protocol. In the US, most long-distance rail, passenger or freight, is pulled by diesel locomotives, except in the Northeast Corridor, where electric trains are much more common. Meanwhile, countries like Japan and India have electrified almost their entire rail networks. Because of the time required to cover long-distance routes, trains on slower journeys will have dining cars and overnight trips will have sleeping cars. As compared with air travel, long-distance rail passengers have a higher degree of personal freedom and mobility. But because of the time it takes to make these journeys, air travel is often more compelling. Even considering the additional time constraints of going through airport security, for most trips longer than 300 miles, airlines offer quicker service. Even in situations where rail might otherwise seem like the preferable option, say New York to Washington, D.C., in the US, longer distance passenger rail has trouble staying competitive with airlines. Speeds on these routes in the US are generally much lower than they are throughout the rest of the world. For shorter, but still considerable distances, intercity passenger rail offers service, self-evidently enough, between cities. These routes facilitate longer commutes for some and inexpensive travel for others. They are usually at least 30 miles and less than 200 or 300. This type of journey is often made by express trains, meaning they make fewer stops. The trains are more comfortable than, say, a metro system, but don't offer the full suite of amenities of a long-distance trip. Like longer journeys, these trains usually travel on the main lines of rail networks. The type of engine they use, be it diesel or electric, is of course determined by the network on which they travel. Next up is commuter rail. The primary distinction between intercity rail and commuter rail can be difficult to draw. Where intercity rail connects two cities, commuter rail aims to connect a city's suburban areas to the urban. There is a considerable overlap in the length of intercity and commuter rail journeys. Commuter rail travels on existing networks much the same way as intercity rail. Unlike long-distance, intercity, or commuter rail, the rest of our categories run on dedicated lines. For shorter distances, metro systems provide mass transit for urban areas. Metros are sometimes referred to as heavy rail because of their high passenger capacities. Where a long-distance passenger rail train might have to wait on a freight train or other traffic, a metro train will only have to wait on other metro trains. The other primary distinction of metro systems is that they are built either above or below ground. Because of this, metros rarely have intersections with other roads, meaning they don't have to deal with pedestrian or car traffic. There are approximately 160 metro systems in the world. Most older metros are below-ground subways, while newer metros tend to be above ground. The deeper the subway is, the less disruption a city will face during construction and operation. However, building below ground is much more expensive than above. Many older subway systems employed the cut and cover technique, in which tunnels are dug under existing roads just below street level. This required shutting down the entire street and rebuilding it, essentially from scratch. Understandably, when cities construct new metro systems today, they are much more hesitant about shutting down major roads. To avoid the high costs of building deep underground and the logistical headache of cut and cover digging, many modern metros are built on elevated lines. An above-ground metro might also be chosen where building underground is impractical. An underground metro in Miami, for example, would be next to impossible because of its coastal proximity and Florida's high water table. Above-ground metro systems have to take noise pollution into deeper consideration than do underground systems. Because of the number of passengers that metro systems serve, they run routes more often with more connective cars than other local rail systems. Metro systems are electric since building underground limits ventilation options for diesel. Like metros, our next category, light rail, also runs on dedicated rails. These trains are lower capacity and generally effective in serving lower density downtowns or areas further from the urban core of larger cities. Light rail networks are more likely to be at the same grade as car and pedestrian traffic, meaning they have intersections where a metro wouldn't. In these cases, the train usually has the right-of-way. Though some diesel trains are considered light rail, the vast majority use overhead power lines. A variation of the light rail is trams and trolleys. These systems are essentially bus-sized light rail. They have very short trains and run on rails alongside car traffic. Tram and trolley lines may have a dedicated lane, or in some cases will share their lane with other traffic. Well, that just about covers the basic categories of passenger rail, but if you want to learn more about transportation or other interesting topics, be sure to subscribe to Amateur Experts. And as always, thanks for watching.